The scrapyard behind Docking Bay 17 was not a place where things were saved. It was a place where things were finished, where the Confederation's endless machine of commerce deposited whatever it had used up, broken down, or simply decided was no longer worth the paperwork of caring about. Rusted hull plating leaned against cracked engine casings, snapped docking cables coiled in heaps like dead serpents. The smell was iron and burnt fuel, and the particular staleness of things left too long in the cold. And there, half buried beneath a collapsed cargo shelf and a tangle of stripped wiring, lay Vess. She was a dragon. That much was obvious, even in the ruin of her current state. The long neck, the folded wings, the scaled body built for sky and altitude, and the kind of freedom that most grounded creatures could only imagine from below. But everything that should have spoken of power and grace spoke instead of damage. Her left wing jutted at an angle that made experienced eyes flinch. Her right wing lay flat and motionless beneath her, the membrane torn in a long diagonal slash. Dust had settled into the grooves between her scales, and her scales, they were white. Not the silver white of a storm dragon, not the pearl white of the deep-sea breeds that occasionally surfaced in the northern ports. They were the flat, stark, almost painful white of albinism, of a body that had never produced the pigment that other dragons wore like armor against the world's judgment. It had been 3 years since any skyport had looked at those white scales and seen something worth welcoming. 3 years of turned backs and locked bay doors and the particular cruelty of being told, in 100 different languages and tones, that her kind were bad luck, ill omens, signs of misfortune to come. 3 years of drifting further and further out to the edges of the trading lanes, where the ports were smaller and the tolerance even less. The scrapyard workers at Dockin. Mara Ose had not come to Docking Bay 17 looking for anything alive. She had come for a set of Class 4 gear housings that a scrapper contact had tipped her about. Good salvage, barely worn, the kind of components that cost 3 times more new than they were worth and twice more than Mara could afford on a slow month. She had parked her repair van at the service entrance at 6:30 in the morning, signed the salvage access form with the distracted efficiency of someone who had signed 1,000 of them, and walked into the yard with her magnetic collection rod swinging and her mind already 3 steps ahead on the day's job list. She smelled of machine oil. She always smelled of machine oil. It had soaked into her hands so thoroughly over the years that no amount of industrial solvent fully removed it anymore. And she had long since stopped trying. Her gray jumpsuit was patched at both elbows with a slightly different shade of gray because matching fabric was an unnecessary expense. Her boots had been resoled twice, the second time by Mara herself, with a bonding compound technically rated for hull plating. They were, structurally speaking, the most over-engineered footwear in the port district. She was cursing quietly and with genuine creativity at a stripped bolt she'd discovered on her collection rod's clamp mechanism. A problem she had fixed twice already and was now fixing a 3rd time through the application of a small wrench and language her mother would not have approved of. She almost missed it entirely. The magnetic rod swung left toward a promising cluster of gear housing near the base of a collapsed shelf, and the arc of her movement pulled her gaze across the heap. And that was when the goggles caught it. She stopped walking. She stopped cursing. She pushed the magnifying goggles down from her forehead to her eyes and stood very still, the way she stood when an engine reading came back wrong and she needed a moment to... Most people, upon finding a dragon in a scrapyard, would have done one of several things. They would have stepped back. They would have called someone. Port authority, animal control, a supervisor, anyone whose job description could be stretched to cover the situation. They would have taken an image with their comm device for the novelty of it. Or, if they belonged to any of the 4 Confederation cultures that considered albino dragons a walking omen of disaster, they would have left considerably faster than they arrived and not looked back. Mara Ose did none of these things. She crouched down, pushed her goggles firmly against her eyes, and looked. The way she looked at every broken thing that came across her workbench. Not with horror, not with pity, not with the flinching discomfort of someone confronted by damage they would rather not acknowledge. She looked with the steady, unsentimental attention of a person trying to understand something completely before deciding what to do about it. Her eyes moved across Vess the way they moved across a damaged engine housing, methodically, starting at the point of most obvious trauma and working outward, cataloging each problem in order of severity without letting any single one of them distort the full picture. Left wing first. The spar bones, the internal structural supports that gave a dragon's wing its rigid framework, had 2 clean breaks, both in the upper third. Not shattered, not splintered. Snapped, the way a load-bearing strut snapped when stress exceeded design tolerance in a single sudden event. A fall, then. A hard one. And the shoulder joint next. Dislocated, not fractured, the socket had separated under impact, which was deeply painful and mechanically disabling, but fundamentally repairable if addressed correctly and soon. The right stabilizer membrane was torn along a diagonal line, the thin tissue that controlled fine aerial adjustments ragged at the edges but not missing. Torn, not. The silence stretched long enough that Mara began to wonder if the dragon could speak at all. Some couldn't, or chose not to, which amounted to the same thing in practical terms. Mara had worked on 3 dragons in her career, all of them the common scaled varieties that passed through the mid-range ports on freight contracts, and exactly one of them had spoken to her directly. The other 2 had communicated through their handlers, which Mara had always found inefficient and slightly insulting to the dragons themselves. She waited. She was not by nature a patient person. Her clients would have laughed at the suggestion, but she had learned a specific kind of patience in her years of repair work. And the patience of someone who understood that rushing a diagnostic produced worse results than simply allowing the problem to reveal itself on its own timeline. Vess revealed herself slowly. The pale throat moved first, then the pink eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance with the unfocused quality of something that had stopped actively looking at the world, shifted incrementally toward Mara's face. And then the voice came, low and carefully level, and worn so smooth by repetition that every edge had been ground off it. They filed me under debris. 5 words. Delivered without anger, without tears, without any of the emotional weight that the sentence deserved to carry. That was almost the worst part of it. Not that it had happened, but that Vess had said it the way someone states the local weather. A fact. A confirmed, repeated, thoroughly verified fact that she had long since stopped expecting anyone to dispute. Mara's face did something complicated. It moved through outrage first, the sharp, immediate kind that arrived before conscious thought, the same expression she made when a client told her a previous mechanic had sealed a cracked fuel coupling with bonding tape and called it a repair. Then it moved into something that live. Vess watched the human open the toolkit with the detached curiosity of someone observing an event they had already determined would not affect them. She had encountered kindness before, or what passed for it. Port workers who left food nearby without making eye contact. A cargo captain who had allowed her to sleep in a docking bay for 2 nights before his supervisor found out and reversed the decision. A child at a refueling station on the outer lanes who had touched her wing with gentle hands before being quickly pulled away by a horrified parent. Kindness existed. Vess did not doubt that. But kindness, in her experience, was a brief weather pattern. It passed through, and then the ordinary climate resumed. So she watched Mara set out her tools with the careful arrangement of someone who knew exactly where everything needed to be. Then she waited for the ordinary climate to resume. "It is pointless," Vess said. Her voice carried no challenge in it, no invitation to argue. She was not asking Mara to agree or disagree. She was simply providing information she considered relevant, the way you might mention to someone boarding a vessel that the navigation system had a known fault. You cannot fix something the world has decided is fundamentally unwanted. The problem is not the wing. She paused. The problem is what I am, and that does not change regardless of whether the wing functions. It was, by any measure, a reasonable position. It was logical, evidence-based, and arrived at through years of thorough field testing across multiple ports and cultures and encounters. Vess had not reached this conclusion quickly or easily, so she had argued against it for a long time before the evidence had simply become too consistent to keep disputing. She expected Mara to pause, to look up, to offer something, reassurance, rebuttal, the well-meaning but ultimately hollow suggestion that things would be different, that people would see past the scales, that the automated compactor ran at midnight. Mara had discovered this by reading the scrapyard's operational schedule on the public access terminal near the service entrance, a document most salvage visitors never bothered to open. It was a thorough document. It listed compactor zones, activation radii, and the system's object detection parameters, which were calibrated to identify and exclude active mechanical units, but said nothing specific about biological ones. Vess was not moving. Vess was barely registering on a thermal scan. The compactor's detection system would not have known the difference between a living dragon and a very large piece of discarded hull plating. Mara went back to her van, pulled out the fold-out cot she kept behind the rear seats for long jobs that ran past reasonable hours, and set it up 6 feet from Vess's side. She told herself it was a practical decision. The gear housings she'd originally come for were still here, and early mornings were the best time to sort salvage before other scrappers arrived. It made sense to stay on site. It was efficient. She did not examine this reasoning too carefully. The first night, Vess said nothing about the cot. The second night, she watched Mara unfold it with an expression that might have been confusion on a face less carefully neutral. The third night, she had stopped watching and simply accepted it, which Mara considered progress of a sort. The meals were a smaller negotiation conducted over several days. Mara ate from cans heated on a coil burner, practical food, chosen for caloric density and shelf stability rather than any culinary ambition. She offered to share each time without pressure, without hovering, setting a portion nearby and returning to her work as though the outcome was of no particular interest to her. Vess refused the first offer with silence. She refused the second with a slight turn of her head, the draconic equivalent of a polite decline from a creature Mara had always talked while she worked. It was not a social habit. She was not by most measures a social person. It was a thinking habit. Externalizing the process forced precision, caught errors before they became mistakes, and filled the particular silence of concentrated work with something other than the sound of her own doubt. She had done it alone in her van for years, narrating repairs to no audience at all, and the practice had never embarrassed her because she had never considered stopping it. She talked Vess through everything. Not in the simplified, careful tone people used when they assumed they were explaining something to someone who wouldn't understand. Mara didn't have that tone. She talked the way she thought, directly, technically, and at the speed her mind moved, which was considerable. She explained the physics of spar bone loading and why the break pattern suggested a single high-impact event rather than accumulated stress fracture. She described the mechanical logic of a dislocated shoulder joint in terms of socket geometry and pressure vectors. She narrated the tension calibration process with the running commentary of someone who found the mathematics genuinely interesting and saw no reason to keep that to herself. She expected silence in return. She was used to silence in return. What she got, on the second day, was a question. It came carefully, measured in its phrasing, precise in its terminology, inserted into a pause in Mara's narration with the hesitant timing of something that had been considered for a while before being released. Vess asked about the load distribution differential between the two wing spars during banking maneuvers at high altitude and whether the splint's current tension ratio accounted for the pressure variance. Mara answered. She kept working. She moved on. Another question came, then another. Each one sharper than the last, each one cutting closer to the technical core of what Mara was D. The answer came slowly, the way Vess did most things now, with the careful pacing of someone who had learned to measure out words in small quantities, because large quantities had historically gone unappreciated. She had not always been a reader. In the early years of her wandering, she had spent her energy on the practical work of survival, finding ports that would tolerate her long enough to earn passage to the next one, negotiating for the kind of marginal peripheral work that didn't require anyone to look at her directly. Loading work, night work, the jobs that happened in the parts of the skyports where appearances were less scrutinized because the hours were too inconvenient for scrutiny. But that work had dried up gradually, port by port, as her reputation as an omen preceded her arrival, and she had found herself with something she had never expected to accumulate in such quantities: time. Libraries, she had discovered, were the most consistently democratic institutions in the Confederation. They were built on the philosophical premise that information belonged to whoever needed it, and this premise, unlike most philosophical premises Vess had encountered, appeared to be practiced with reasonable consistency. No librarian had turned her away. A few had stared. One had asked, with genuine academic curiosity rather than hostility, whether she would consent to a brief survey on non-human library usage patterns. She had consented. She had also borrowed 11 books that visit. Mara listened without interrupting as Vess listed what the years had produced. Fluid dynamics, and because the sky was the one place she had ever felt fully herself, and she wanted to understand it completely. Xenobiology, because understanding other species had seemed like it might illuminate why they responded to her the way they did. Higher mathematics, because it was the one language that did not have a word for omen or ill fortune or unwanted. Shipping route heist. Mara was quiet for longer than usual after Vess finished speaking. This was notable because Mara's relationship with silence was generally a brief and transactional one. She moved through it quickly on her way to the next thought, the next sentence, the next piece of the problem she was working on. Sustained quiet was not a natural habitat for her. She generated noise the way her coil burner generated heat, consistently, automatically, as a byproduct of simply functioning. But she sat back on her heels, and she looked at Vess, and the quiet stretched out to 5 seconds, then 10, then something longer than that. It was the expression she wore for engines that had been written off prematurely. Not sentimentality. Mara did not have a great deal of sentimentality, and what she had she kept in a small, well-organized compartment that she opened infrequently. It was the expression of someone revising an estimate dramatically upward, of someone who had expected a certain scale of problem and found themselves looking at something considerably larger and more intricate, and this was the part that produced the particular quality of the look, considerably more worth the effort than the initial assessment had suggested. She picked up her tools. She turned them over in her hands without immediately using them, which was another unusual behavior. "I've run this business alone for 6 years, she said, in the tone she used for stating facts that she had accepted, but not entirely made peace with. "Not because I prefer working alone, because I'm bad at hiring people." She paused, then apparently deciding that statement required elaboration in the interest of accuracy. "I'm bad at hiring people because I cannot get through an interview without insulting someone's incompetence. It's not intentional. It's diagnostic. I identify the problem, and I say it aloud before I've assessed whether saying it aloud is strategically useful." Another pause. "It has never once been. It came on the 7th day. offered the way Mara offered most things, without preamble, without ceremony, slipped into the middle of a working silence like a tool being set down on a workbench. She had been recalibrating the tension on the right membrane splint, running through the adjustment sequence she performed twice daily with the focused repetition of someone who understood that consistency was the difference between a repair that held and one that failed at the worst possible moment. Vess had been watching, as she usually did, that quiet, precise attention that Mara had come to recognize as the way Vess engaged with anything she found genuinely interesting. Mara tightened the final calibration point. She checked the tension reading. She noted it in the small, weathered log she kept for every job, regardless of whether anyone would ever ask to see it. Then, without looking up, "I need a partner." She said it the way she said most true things, directly, without softening the edges, because softening edges was a form of imprecision, and Mara had no patience for imprecision. She laid it out plainly after that. 6 years alone. The high-altitude jobs on the upper docking gantries that required climbing equipment she didn't fully trust and produced on 3 separate occasions, outcomes that her clients had never heard about because she had resolved them through a combination of quick thinking and sheer refusal to fall. The growing list of contracts she had turned down because they required a second pair of hands she didn't have. The equal stake. Not employment. Not a favor, not charity dressed in professional language, but a genuine division of ownership and responsibility, and whatever the business became. Vess would handle the high work, the altitude jobs, the upper hull assessments, the repairs on the elevated structures that turned every job into a survival exercise for anyone without wings. Mara would handle everything else, and there woe. Vess had become an expert in silences. This was not a skill she had cultivated deliberately. It had accumulated the way most of her harder-won knowledge had, through prolonged exposure to necessity. She had learned to read them the way navigators read atmospheric pressure, as information, as warning, as an accurate indicator of what was coming next. The silence of a port worker who had just noticed her scales and was deciding how quickly to redirect her elsewhere. The silence of a cargo captain reviewing her application and arriving at the part where species and coloring were listed. The silence of a waiting room that had been comfortable before she entered it and was no longer. She knew what those silences contained. She had cataloged them thoroughly. This one was different. It arrived after Mara's 3 words settled. I'm talking about after. And it was not the silence of rejection forming or patience running out or tolerance reaching its natural boundary. It had none of those textures. It had no familiar texture at all, which was precisely what made it so difficult to navigate. Vess turned the words over carefully, the way she turned over complex mathematical proofs, looking for the flaw in the structure, the place where the logic failed, the point at which the apparent conclusion would reveal itself as an error. She was good at finding those points. She had found them reliably for 3 years, every time something had briefly resembled hope before resolving into its actual shape. She looked for the resolution. She waited for the shape to clarify. It did not clarify. It stayed exactly what it appeared to be. The offer had been specific, practical, structurally sound, equal stake, defined responsibilities, built on an accurate assessment of complementary capabilities rather than sentiment or pity. Mara did not do sentiment or pity. Vess had established this through 7 days of careful observation. Mara did accurate assessments, and the Port Authority logging system at Docking Bay 17 was not designed to handle ambiguity. It was a practical piece of administrative infrastructure built for the straightforward documentation of arrivals, departures, cargo manifests, and service records. It had drop-down categories and standardized fields and a design philosophy rooted in the assumption that most things passing through a skyport could be accurately described by one of 47 pre-existing classifications. It was efficient, thorough, and entirely unprepared for what the morning operator encountered when she sat down at the terminal at 0630 hours on the 61st day and began processing the overnight log. She read the entry twice, then she called her supervisor over, not because any action was required, but because some things are instinctively shared, the small, anomalous moments that don't fit the shape of an ordinary shift and lodge themselves in memory precisely because of it. Her supervisor read it twice as well. Neither of them had been on duty at 0614. The entry had been filed by the automated perimeter system, which logged all departures from the yard regardless of classification, and it had done so with the same flat, bureaucratic neutrality it applied to everything, recording the facts, attaching the timestamp, filing the notation under the appropriate case number without any indication that it understood what it was documenting. Organic debris unit reclassified. The reclassification had been Mara's work, completed the previous afternoon. She had gone to the administrative terminal near the service entrance and navigated the filing system with the methodical persistence she applied to stripped bolts and seized calibration points, working through each layer of bureaucratic resistance until she found the field she needed and changed what was written in it. It had taken 40 minutes and 3 separate appeals to a supervisor who had seemed uncertain. The reputation did not build the way reputations usually built. Gradually, through accumulation, reference by reference and contract by contract, until a critical mass of goodwill tipped into general awareness. It built fast, faster than Mara had planned for, which was saying something, because Mara planned for most contingencies with the thoroughness of someone who had learned through experience that the universe rewarded preparation and punished optimism. The first contract had been the Meridian Drift job, a structural assessment on a mid-range freight hauler whose upper hull plating had developed a fault that 2 previous repair outfits had failed to correctly locate. Mara had diagnosed the root cause in 40 minutes. Vess had located 3 secondary stress points in the surrounding structure that the diagnostic had not flagged, and identified by the minute variations in atmospheric pressure displacement that her senses registered the way other creatures registered temperature. The repair had held. The freight captain had told 2 colleagues. The colleagues had told others. By the 3rd month, they had more work than Mara's scheduling system could process without modification, so she modified it. What the clients were paying for, technically, was structural and aeronautical repair across all vessel classes. What they were receiving in practice, and was something that the Confederation's repair industry had not previously offered in this particular configuration. The combination of Mara's diagnostic precision and Vess's sensory capabilities producing assessments of an accuracy that made clients review their previous repair records with the uncomfortable feeling that they had been operating with incomplete information for years. Vess could detect stress fractures that had not yet propagated to visible damage, hairline failures in load-bearing structures, micro-separations in hull welds, the early-stage fatigue patterns in engine-mounting assemblies. The reviews were taken as a collection, an interesting document in the limitations of language. Mara read them occasionally, not out of vanity but because client feedback was data, and data was useful, and ignoring available data was the kind of thing that led to missed fault points and preventable failures. She read them with the same practical attention she gave technical reports, extracting the actionable information and setting the rest aside. The actionable information was straightforward enough. Response time, pricing accuracy, communication quality, whether the repair had held at the intervals clients bothered to check. These parts of the reviews were clear and consistent and told Mara things she could work with. It was the other parts that accumulated into something she found harder to categorize. Clients struggled. Across dozens of reviews written in 7 different languages and varying levels of technical vocabulary, to articulate something they had apparently all experienced and none of them could quite name. They circled it from different directions. They used different words. Thorough came up frequently, and precise, and honest, and one client who operated a mid-range passenger vessel on the outer lanes had written they treated my ship like it mattered in a way that suggested he had not always found this to be the case. What they were describing, without having the framework to describe it directly, was the difference between repair as transaction and repair as comprehension. Most outfits in the Confederation's service industry approached a broken thing as a problem with a defined solution. Identify the presenting fault. I address the presenting fault, invoice the client, move to the next job. It was efficient. It was, by the metrics the industry measured itself against, entirely adequate. Mara had never been able to work that way. It was not a philosophy she had adopted. It was a constitutional inability, the same way it happened at a mid-tier skyport on the outer Confederation lanes, 14 months into the life of Ose and Vess, on a contracted hull assessment job for a shipping company whose fleet manager had hired them on the recommendation of 3 separate colleagues and was now, standing in the shadow of his own docking bay, visibly reconsidering. He was not a cruel man. Mara had assessed this within the first 2 minutes of meeting him. He had the discomfort of someone raised on inherited beliefs he had never personally examined, rather than the harder-edged conviction of someone who had examined them and chosen to keep them anyway. He watched Vess unload the equipment cases from the van with the expression of a person whose rational mind and cultural conditioning were conducting an unresolved argument somewhere behind his eyes. And he waited until Vess had taken the first equipment case and lifted to the upper gantry before he sidled toward Mara with the careful casualness of someone attempting a conversation they had not quite decided to have. "Is it—" he began. Then, recalibrating his phrasing, "Is it really safe? Working with—" A gesture upward, imprecise, encompassing Vess and her wings and her coloring and 3,000 years of superstition, that he had the decency to look slightly embarrassed about invoking. Mara looked at him. It was a specific look, the one she reserved for diagnostic errors and stripped bolts, and any instance of someone presenting mythology as engineering data. It was not unkind. It was simply the look of a person who had no patience for the category of error being made and was deciding how much of that to communicate directly, and she decided on most of it. "She's my partner," Mara said. The word carried the weight she had always given it. Not employer, not employee, not charity case, not curiosity. Partner, equal stake, equal standing, the specific word that meant what it said and was chosen because accuracy mattered. She's C,